Hello, everyone. Welcome to part one of Old Head's top 20 bands of all time. So, around 4 years ago, when I was doing the Old Head podcast, when all of this video shit was pretty much brand new to me, I did an episode of the podcast where I counted down my top 10 favorite bands of all time. And in the 4 years that has passed since then, I've realized that my top 10 has actually changed. And I'm like, that's pretty interesting. So maybe I should do an updated top 10. But then I thought to myself, no, let's go one further. Because I know even back then, there were bands that I just left out, that I just felt so bad that I didn't at least get to mention. And so I expanded it to a top 20. And even then, I still had to leave some amazing bands out. But I had to draw the line somewhere, and I drew the line at 20. And so today for part one, we're going to be counting down number 20 down to number 16. The first fourth of the top 20 bands of all time, according to me. These are my top 20 favorite bands of all time. Let's just get that out of the way. Not yours, mine. And as usual, because I'm such a complete dork about this shit, I made some rules to kind of make it a little easier for me. Number one, it has to be a band, meaning a group of musicians who play together under a particular name that's not a name of the frontman of the band. So unfortunately, I could not include Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, even though I love Tom Petty. Doesn't qualify for my criteria. And the second stipulation that I made for myself was that the band has to have put out at least 3 albums. Because, there are some bands that put out a couple really banging albums and then kind of fell off for me. So I felt that 3 albums is kind of the sweet spot of like, is this a favorite band of mine? Did they last 3 albums or more while still maintaining my attention? So let's jump right into it. But first, a little disclaimer.
Band inclusion and placement subject to change without notice. The views and opinions of present Old Head do not necessarily reflect those of future Old Head. Consult your physician to see if ranking bands is right for you. Prices and participation may vary. Under 18, get your parents' permission.
All right. Now that that's out of the way, let's start ranking Old Head's top 20 bands of all time. Mastodon, the most recent band in my top 20. And they're a band that started around the year 2000. So at this point, they're 23 fucking years old. But newer to me. But they're a very important band to me. And I may have spoken about this before, but Mastodon, for me, came along in my life around the time of their Leviathan album. And at that time, in the early 2000s, I had gone through a period of being disenchanted by the world of heavy rock music, rock or metal or whatever. And I had spent a few years, several years, trying to figure out, like, who the fuck am I? What am I even trying to do? I became a very annoying kind of music snob kind of dude for a little bit. And it was all just growing pains of me trying to figure out, who am I? And it turns out that I just came right back to where I was in my teenage years, and that was being a fucking metalhead. And the band that kind of led me down the path to discovering or rediscovering myself was Mastodon. As soon as I heard Leviathan, I was like, holy shit, man, I fucking love big ass fucking metal. And it not only led me to listening to metal bands of the early 2000s, but it also led me all the way back down to rediscovering all of this shit that I loved and shit from the 80s and 90s that I had just not given enough time to. And that's a process that is still ongoing. The vinyl collecting, the videos that I do, I'm constantly looking for stuff that maybe was overlooked back in the day, or stuff that maybe I didn't give enough of a chance to back in the day, or just revisiting stuff that I'm like, oh, I loved this. Let's see if it has the same effect on me. And it's just this cycle of this, like, all this amazing music. And it led me to you guys. And you have Mastodon to thank for that. Now, they come in at number 20 because overall, I've had probably the least amount of time with their discography, and they aren't tied to what I refer to as the sweet spot for heavy music, which was the late 80s and the early 90s. They're newer. And so there's a less nostalgic feeling that I get when I listen to Mastodon, but I still absolutely adore everything they've ever done. My favorites are easily Leviathan, and coming in very closely at number 2 is Crack the Skye, where they got a little more progressive. And that's why I love this band, because they started out more aggressive and they got gradually more and more experimental with what they were doing. Are they going to be proggy? Are they going to be more straightforward rock? You never really know, but you do know that you're going to get some quality shit every fucking time with Mastodon. So they come in at number 20 in my top 20 bands of all time. Van Halen, one of the most important bands in my life. You could probably say the most important band when it comes to the music that I love, because it all began with this album right here, Van Halen 1984. I heard the album back in 1984 when I was 6 years old. Could have been 7, maybe it was a little later. I don't remember. That was a long time ago. But it was the first rock album with big guitars that I had ever heard, and it just made me crave that sound. All of a sudden, I'm like looking for whatever rock albums I could find. And if there was a picture of the band on there and they had long hair and they looked like they might be kind of mean or like some party animals, you bet your ass I was going to be listening to that. And that led me down the path to heavier and heavier stuff, led me to thrash metal, led me to death metal, and all of the other shit that I love. It basically sent young head on the path to becoming the old head that you all know and love. And Van Halen are an important band because there's some bands that you love that maybe you're really impressed by their songwriting, or maybe there's some really deep emotional things that tie you to a particular band. But my favorite thing about Van Halen, aside from them just being amazing musicians, is that it's a band that I know I can always turn to for a good time. And that's really important to me because I am a person that finds myself getting overwhelmed with things at times. And it's good to have certain bands you can fall back on and you can say, you know what? I know if I ever need to go have a good time, I know Van Halen is going to be there for me. And I love all Van Halen. I love Van Hagar. It depends on my mood, because sometimes there are some things that only Van Hagar can give me. Other times it's got to be Van Halen with David Lee Roth. Sometimes I might even listen to Van Halen 3 with Gary Cherone, because that dude's a fantastic singer. But no matter what, I just know that I'm going to have a good time, and I know that the guitar work is always going to be fucking mind-blowing. And so that's why Van Halen comes in at number 19. That sounds really far down, but we have a long way to go. And I'm explaining all of my choices, but trust me, Van Halen, it makes sense for them to go here at number 19. Acid Reign, my favorite UK thrash metal band. And honestly, my relationship with Acid Reign and UK thrash only really goes back about 10 years, because back in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of these albums were coming out, there was no press for that over here in America. I never saw music videos. I didn't know about these bands. It took the internet, and specifically YouTube, to all of a sudden turn me onto this world of UK thrash from the same era as all these other bands that I loved. And very quickly, Acid Reign was the one that rose to the top, mostly because they had several different elements that I love. They weren't afraid to have a sense of humor, first off, but their music was not jokey. Their music had progressive qualities in it as well. So it's almost like a meeting of State of Euphoria and Justice for All. You know, I don't know, but you get what I'm saying. Like there is an energy to their music, and even though, while some people do seem to mistakenly think that the lyrics are jokey, for the most part they're not, but there still is this infectious energy that really kind of puts them above even a lot of classic US thrash bands. And they've since become an even more important band to me because I started, I would say, a friendship. Howard, what do you think? With the lead vocalist, Howard H. Smith, and we do a podcast / YouTube show together called Old Bollocks. Watch it if you haven't. But another great thing about Acid Reign is that they did all this great shit and then broke up and then reformed with a different lineup 20 whatever years later and put out this fucking banger of an album, which was my album of the year in 2019. And so all of these things together, I'm like, man, this band is one of those bands that kicked so much ass and then came back and didn't just phone it in. We also did a Cranked and Ranked episode where we ranked all of these. Well, no, the albums. But anyway, go listen to it. If you don't know Acid Rain, it might be a good introduction, or just go search their name on YouTube and just go listen to whatever. But if you know, you know. Cannibal Corpse. So, back in 92, 93, when I was an impressionable 14, 15-year-old kid getting into music, that I had started off with Van Halen and I had worked my way up to getting into heavier music, and I was always looking for the heaviest shit that I could find. And then eventually I found death metal. And the first two bands that I ever heard, I'm not sure which one I heard first, were Obituary and Cannibal Corpse. And the second that I heard Hammer Smashed Face, it was all over. Like, they were the band that had set the bar for death metal extreme music at that point. So it was the heaviest thing and the most brutal thing and frankly the creepiest thing I had ever heard, and I absolutely loved it, and I've been a fan ever since. And while there were other death metal bands at the time that I was also into, some of which I really loved that unfortunately I had to leave off of this list, but Cannibal Corpse was one of those bands that continued to put out music that still had me doing the riff face. And even their most recent album, like every single album, they haven't necessarily strayed too far. They've had a little bit of a progression from album number one, but it's almost been like little tiny steps and just little things here and there that to most people you wouldn't even notice it because it's just a big barrage of fucking noise and growling. But they've managed to hold my attention for this many years, even up until now, without ever putting out one of those albums that absolutely divides everybody. At least I don't think that they have. But in the end, there may be other bands that are more technical and more talented, and bands that are more brutal, or bands that give you a better variety of stuff. It doesn't matter. Cannibal Corpse is the death metal band for me that has somehow found this sweet spot when it comes to the shit that I want out of death metal, and they just keep delivering it over and over and over again, even as fucking old dudes. So, yeah, number 17, Cannibal Corpse. Topping off the first fourth of my list, Suicidal Tendencies. Another band that I know I can always go to feel energized and excited and just in a good mood in general. When it comes to the crossover thrash style, they are my favorite, but I love the entire trajectory and their progression. The first album is, to me, one of the greatest albums of the 1980s, and they just continued to make amazing albums. Suicidal for Life is an unappreciated gem of the early 90s, and even their more recent shit that they were doing. Back when they had Dave Lombardo on drums, I have a feeling he's probably not with them anymore because he's now with Testament. But whatever, they've had a slew of amazing musicians, and they didn't just stick with doing the same shit the entire time. Their discography is a blast to listen to from beginning to end if you want to. Eventually, we will get to doing a Cranked and Ranked on Suicidal Tendencies. We have a lot of bands to go through. But needless to say, Mike Muir has kept this thing going for such a long time and never delivered anything but absolute quality. And hopefully he'll continue to do that. Lights, Camera, Revolution is a personal favorite for me, but don't sleep on Art of Rebellion, man. Like that, this is the kind of album that I love when a band says, fuck it, we don't have to do the kind of shit everyone expects us to do. They experiment, and all the fucking songs are killer. So you get all these different flavors. You want some just hardcore punk? You got it. You want some thrash metal? You got it. You want some sort of alternative kind of thing? You want more groove? What do you want? Suicidal Tendencies has got it for you. And more importantly, for me. So there you have it. The first fourth of Old Head's top 20 bands of all time. Remember, these are my favorites, folks. Not yours. But I thank you very much for watching. Feel free to put your comments down below. I mean, if you want to do this ranking along with me, what is your number 20 band down to your number 16 band? That'd be fun. Everybody do that shit. But that's it. I've kept you here entirely too long. That's why I've cut this up into 4 different chunks. So I'll be back again in a little bit with part 2. You know, you won't have to wait for long, but you know, I got other shit I gotta do. Anyway, all right, I gotta go, guys. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you've made it this far, it means you give a shit about my opinion, which is awesome and weird at the same time, but I thank you, and I will see you all again very soon.